Trust me, when you hear what this mother did to the woman who tried to erase her from her own son's life, you'll understand why revenge truly is an art form. The phone call that changed everything came at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I remember the exact time because I was staring at my kitchen clock, waiting for the insurance adjuster to call about my car accident from the week before. Instead, it was my daughter-in-law's voice, cold and flat, like air before a snowstorm. "Marlene, Garrett's gone." The words slid into my ear, but didn't land anywhere. "Gone? Gone where?" She didn't soften. "He passed away. Cancer. It happened fast, really fast. The doctors said there was nothing anyone could do." Cancer. The same thief that had taken my husband Robert 3 years ago. I'd watched him waste away for 8 months, clinging to every scrap of time we had left. And now I was hearing that my son, my only child, had gone through that without me. No hospital visits. No final phone call. No chance to sit by his bed and hold his hand. My throat tightened. When did this happen? Last Thursday. Thursday. 5 days ago. I thought about those 5 days, me at the grocery store, watching old movies, complaining to the pharmacy about my prescription. Living my life, not knowing my world had already ended. "Why didn't you tell me?" My voice trembled, though I tried to keep it steady. She sighed, annoyed. "He didn't want to worry you. You know how you get about medical stuff. Remember the gallbladder surgery? Garrett thought it would be easier this way." Easier for who? The thought burned in my chest. I tried to picture his last days, but the image was just a blur of hospital white and his voice fading away. I took a shaky breath, clinging to one thought. There was still the funeral. At least I could see him one last time, lay flowers on his casket, tell him goodbye. "When is the funeral?" I asked quietly. "What date have you set?" The silence on the other end stretched too long. Then Brittany's voice came back, sharp and final. "It's already done. We buried him on Saturday. Just a small ceremony for close family only." For a moment, I couldn't speak. My chest ached, as if someone had reached inside and pulled something vital out. "You buried my son without me?" My voice cracked, and I heard myself gasp for air between the words. "You didn't even give me a chance to see him, to say goodbye, to be his mother one last time?" Tears blurred my vision. The kitchen walls seemed to tilt around me. I gripped the table's edge, trying to steady myself, but the weight of it all pressed down until I felt small, crushed, and hollow. When I could finally force the words past the lump in my throat, they came out as barely a whisper. "Where is he buried?" "Green Valley Cemetery. Plot 247, B in the new section." The line went dead. I sat there in my kitchen for I don't know how long, holding that silent phone like it might bring my boy back. The clock ticked past 4 p.m., then 4:30. Outside, Mrs. Henderson was walking her little dog like she did every day at this time. Everything looked normal, but my world had just exploded into a million pieces. The kitchen still smelled like the banana bread I'd baked that morning, thinking I might take some to Garrett's apartment later in the week. Now that banana bread seemed like a cruel joke. I'd never take him homemade treats again. I'd never get another one of his texts complaining about his latest dating disaster. I'd never hear him call me Mom in that particular way he did when he needed something but was trying to sound casual about it. I tried to remember the last time I'd talked to him. It had been 3 weeks ago, maybe 4. He'd called on a Sunday as usual, but the conversation had been shorter than normal. He'd seemed distracted, maybe a little stressed. I'd asked if everything was okay, and he'd said work was just busy. Now I wondered if he was already sick then. Had he already known something was wrong? The house felt impossibly quiet. Too quiet. I walked through the rooms we'd shared when he was growing up, looking at all the pictures of him at various ages. There he was at 5, missing his front teeth and grinning at the camera. At 10, holding up a fish he'd caught on our camping trip. At 16, all arms and legs in his graduation cap and gown. At 25, arm around his father at Robert's birthday party just a year before the cancer diagnosis. In every picture, he looked happy, healthy, alive. How could he be gone? The next morning, I drove to Green Valley Cemetery with a bouquet of sunflowers from the grocery store. Garrett had loved sunflowers ever since he was little, always pointing them out on road trips, saying they looked like the sun was smiling at him. I remembered buying him a packet of sunflower seeds when he was 8, and we planted them in our backyard together. That summer, they grew taller than him, and he'd run around the garden pretending he was lost in a sunflower forest. Robert had taken pictures of him peeking out between the giant yellow blooms, his face paint-streaked with dirt and pure joy. The cemetery was bigger than I expected, with rolling hills and old oak trees that probably watched over thousands of goodbye hugs over the years. Some of the headstones dated back to the 1800s, weathered and tilted, but still standing guard over their inhabitants. I found the office and asked the lady at the desk about plot 247B. She was nice enough, maybe in her 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her nameplate said Dorothy. She had the gentle, practiced manner of someone who dealt with grieving families every day. "Oh yes," she said, checking her computer. "Garrett Hutchinson. Such a young man. I'm sorry for your loss." "I'm his mother," I said, and saying those words out loud made it real in a way that hurt worse than anything I'd ever felt. It was like admitting defeat, accepting a reality I wasn't ready to face. Dorothy's expression softened even more. "I'm so sorry, dear. Losing a child is, well, there are no words. Would you like me to walk you to the grave site?" "Thank you, but I think I need to do this alone." She gave me directions to the new section, and I walked through rows of headstones until I found a fresh patch of dirt with a temporary marker. No headstone yet, just a small plastic sign with his name and dates. Garrett Michael Hutchinson, March 15th, 1989 to November 7th, 2023. March 15th. I'd been in labor for 14 hours on that day 34 years ago. Robert had held my hand and told me jokes to keep me distracted from the pain. When Garrett finally arrived, screaming and red-faced and perfect, Robert had cried harder than I did. "He's so beautiful," he'd whispered. "He looks just like you." I knelt down and put the sunflowers on the dark soil. "I'm sorry I wasn't here, baby," I whispered. "Mama's here now." That's when I noticed something weird. The dirt wasn't settled right. I've seen enough fresh graves in my 58 years to know what they're supposed to look like, and this one seemed wrong somehow. Too neat. Too perfect. When my husband Robert died 3 years ago, his grave had looked different, more natural, like the earth had been really disturbed by something heavy being buried. This looked more like someone had just scattered some loose dirt around to make it look fresh. But grief makes you think crazy things, so I pushed the thought away and sat there talking to my son until the sun started setting. I told him about Mrs. Henderson's new puppy, about how his favorite restaurant had finally added that sandwich he always requested to their menu, about how much I missed him already. I promised to come back soon with more flowers, maybe some of those little solar lights he'd always said would look nice in a garden. 2 weeks later, Brittany called me screaming. "What are you doing to me, Marlene? What did you do?" I was folding laundry in my living room, trying to keep my hands busy so my mind wouldn't wander to dark places. Staying busy was the only way I could get through the days. I'd been sorting through Garrett's old things that I still had in my house, his high school yearbooks, and some clothes he'd left behind when he moved out. Everything smelled like the lavender sachets I kept in the linen closet, but underneath that, I could still catch hints of his cologne from years ago. "What are you talking about?" "The insurance. The life insurance company called me today. They said someone filed a complaint saying they need to investigate before they pay out. They said someone reported that Garrett might not actually be dead." My stomach dropped. I didn't call any insurance company. Then who did? Who else would do something like that? I sat down hard on my couch, a half-folded towel falling to the floor. Brittany, what insurance? How much money are we talking about? This was news to me. In all the conversations I'd had with Garrett over the years, he'd never mentioned having life insurance. I knew he had health insurance through his job and car insurance, but life insurance seemed like something a single man in his 30s wouldn't think about. Another long pause. When she spoke again, her voice was different. Careful, like she was choosing her words very deliberately. Just as work policy. You know, normal stuff. But something in her tone made my mom instincts kick in. The same feeling I used to get when teenage Garrett would tell me he was going to study at the library, but I could smell cigarette smoke on his jacket. It was that particular combination of defensiveness and evasion that kids use when they're not telling the whole truth. How much, Brittany? It doesn't matter. The point is, someone is trying to mess with me, and I think it's you. I would never do that. I just want to grieve my son in peace. She hung up again. I stared at the phone, my mind racing. Someone had called the insurance company, but it wasn't me. So who was it? And why would they think Garrett wasn't really dead? The whole conversation felt off. Brittany had sounded nervous, almost panicked. And she'd been vague about the insurance amount, which seemed strange for something that should be straightforward. I tried to remember what I knew about Brittany. She and Garrett had been married for 2 years, but I never felt close to her. She was polite enough when I saw her, but there was always a distance there. She never called just to chat, never seemed interested in family stories or traditions. At family gatherings, she spent most of her time on her phone or making excuses to leave early. Garrett had seemed happy with her, but looking back, I wondered if I'd been seeing what I wanted to see rather than what was really there. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that perfect dirt at the cemetery, about Brittany's voice when she mentioned insurance money, about how my son supposedly died of cancer, but never called to tell me he was sick. Garrett had always been a mama's boy, even as an adult. When he'd gotten food poisoning 2 years ago, he called me 3 times a day for updates on how he was feeling. When he'd broken his arm playing basketball in college, I was the first person he called, even before the doctor had finished setting the cast. The idea that he would go through cancer treatment without telling me was impossible to believe. He knew how I'd been with Robert during his illness. He knew I'd want to be there, to help however I could. Even if he was trying to protect me from worry, he would have told me eventually. He wouldn't have been able to keep something that big to himself. At 2:43 a.m., I made a decision that would change everything. The next morning, I called Garrett's work. I figured I'd start there, maybe talk to his boss or some coworkers who might know what really happened. Maybe someone had noticed he was getting sick, or had been going to doctor's appointments. A cheerful receptionist answered. TechFlow Solutions, how can I help you?
I'm Marlena Hutchinson.
I'm calling about my son, Garrett Hutchinson. He worked there and he passed away recently. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry for your loss. Let me transfer you to HR. A few minutes later, a woman named Patricia came on the line. Mrs. Hutchinson, I'm so sorry about Garrett. He was such a sweet young man. Thank you. I was wondering, did he seem sick before he died? Did anyone notice anything? Patricia was quiet for a moment, and I could hear computer keys clicking in the background. Mrs. Hutchinson, I hate to tell you this, but Garrett left the company about 6 months ago. He put in his 2 weeks' notice and said he was moving to start fresh somewhere new. The room started spinning.
What?
No, that can't be right. He was working there when he died. I'm looking at his file right now. His last day was May 15th. He cleaned out his desk and everything. He seemed really excited about whatever he was planning to do next. I hung up and sat there staring at the wall. If Garrett quit his job 6 months ago, where had he been going every day? Where was he living? And why did Brittany tell me he died from cancer when he wasn't even working at the company that supposedly had his life insurance? Nothing made sense. I try to think back to our conversations over the past 6 months. Had he mentioned his new job? Had he said anything about changing companies? I couldn't remember anything specific, but then again, I hadn't been paying close attention to the details. He was an adult with his own life. I'd assumed everything was fine, because he seemed fine. But now I was wondering if I'd been completely wrong about everything. I grabbed my purse and car keys. It was time to visit Garrett's apartment. I still had a key to Garrett's place from when I used to water his plants during business trips. It was a nice little apartment complex about 20 minutes from my house, with a pool and a gym that he actually used. I'd helped him move in there 4 years ago, and we'd spent a whole weekend painting the walls and arranging furniture. He'd been so proud of having his own place, especially after living with roommates for years after college. The complex was called Riverside Gardens, though there wasn't much of a river or many gardens visible. It was one of those modern places with beige siding and black shutters, designed to look upscale but affordable. Garrett's apartment was on the second floor, number 4B, with a small balcony that faced the parking lot. I knocked first, just in case. No answer. I used my key and stepped inside. The apartment was completely empty. Not just empty like someone had moved out and taken their stuff. Empty like no one had lived there in months.
No quietest.
Nothing. Even the carpet had those little dents where furniture used to be, but they looked old and settled. The walls still had the nail holes from where his pictures used to hang, but even those looked like they'd been there for a while. I walked through every room twice, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The kitchen had been cleaned thoroughly, but I could see where marks on the countertops where his coffee maker and microwave used to sit. The bathroom was spotless, but the medicine cabinet was completely empty. Even the bedroom, where he'd had his computer desk and his bed, was nothing but bare walls and carpet. In what used to be his bedroom, I found something that made my blood run cold. A piece of mail on the floor by the window. It was addressed to Garrett, but the postmark was from August 14th, 2.5 months before he supposedly died. It was an eviction notice. According to the paper, Garrett had been evicted for not paying rent for 3 months. The apartment had been cleaned out and re-rented on August 30th. The notice was stamped with court seals and everything completely official. There were late fees listed, legal filing fees, and a final total that made my heart sink. My son had owed almost $4,000 in back rent and penalties. I called the apartment office right from the empty living room, sitting on the floor where his couch used to be. "Hi, this is about apartment 4B, I said to whoever answered. "I'm the mother of the previous tenant, Garrett Hutchinson." "Oh yes, such a shame. Is he doing better now?" My heart stopped. Better? Well, when he moved out, he mentioned he was going through some tough times. Financial problems, I think.
He seemed really stressed about something.
I hope things worked out for him. When exactly did you last see him? Oh, probably late July. Maybe early August. He came by to turn in his keys and apologize for the mess. Nice young man, just seemed like he was in some kind of trouble. I thanked her and hung up, then sat down on the floor of my son's empty apartment and cried until I couldn't cry anymore. Garrett had been in trouble. Money trouble. He'd lost his job, lost his apartment, and disappeared somewhere around August. And somehow, 3 months later, Brittany was telling me he died of cancer and been buried. But if Garrett had been struggling, why hadn't he called me? I would have helped him. I would have done anything for my boy. We'd always been close, especially after his father died. I'd been his emergency contact, his reference for jobs, the person he called when he was sick or scared or just needed to talk. Unless he couldn't call me. Unless something had happened that made it impossible for him to reach out. I tried to remember any signs I might have missed. Had he sounded different during our last few phone calls? Had he seemed stressed or distracted? I thought back to that last conversation, trying to recall every detail. He'd called on a Sunday evening like always, but it had been shorter than usual. He'd said work was busy, but now I knew he didn't even have a job. What else had he said? What else had I missed? I spent the next day calling every hospital in a 50-mile radius, asking if they had any record of Garrett being treated for cancer. Most of them wouldn't tell me anything because of privacy laws, even when I explained I was his mother and he was dead. But the fifth hospital I called, St. Mary's Medical Center, had a different response. Hutchinson, Garrett, the records clerk repeated. Let me check our system thoroughly. No, I don't show any patient by that name in our system. Are you sure about the spelling? I was sure. I spelled it out letter by letter, gave them his birth date, his social security number. Nothing. I tried 2 more hospitals with the same result. No record of Garrett being treated anywhere for cancer. Not even an emergency room visit or an outpatient consultation. According to every medical facility in the area, my son had never been a patient. That's when I decided to do something that probably wasn't legal, but I didn't care anymore. I drove back to Green Valley Cemetery. This time, I didn't go to the office. I parked by the road and walked straight to plot 247B. It was almost sunset, and there was nobody else around. The groundskeepers had all gone home for the day. The cemetery was quiet except for the sound of wind through the oak trees and the distant hum of traffic on the main road. I knelt down by the temporary marker and started digging with my hands. I know how that sounds. I know it seems crazy. But I had to know if my son was really down there, or if this was all some kind of horrible lie. The dirt was softer than I expected, like it had been disturbed recently. I dug maybe 6 inches down when my fingers hit something hard. It wasn't a coffin. It was wood, but the wrong kind. Like old fence boards or construction scraps. I cleared away more dirt and found what looked like a makeshift box made from random pieces of lumber, maybe 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. Way too small for a person. I sat back on my heels, my hands covered in dirt, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. There was no body in this grave. Whatever was buried here, it wasn't my son, which meant Garrett was either buried somewhere else or he wasn't dead at all. The next morning, I hired a private investigator named Jack Morrison. He was recommended by my neighbor's daughter who'd used him during her messy divorce. Jack was maybe 60, with gray hair and tired eyes that had probably seen everything twice. His office was in a strip mall between a tax preparation service and a nail salon, but it was clean and professional inside. Let me get this straight, he said, sitting across from me in his small office. Your daughter-in-law says your son died of cancer and was buried, but you think he might still be alive? I know it sounds crazy. Lady, I've heard crazier. Tell me everything. I told him about the phone call, the empty apartment, the hospitals with no records, and the fake grave. Jack listened without interrupting, taking notes in a little notebook. His handwriting was surprisingly neat for someone with such large hands. How much life insurance are we talking about? He asked when I finished. I don't know. Brittany wouldn't say. That's the first thing we need to find out. Money's usually the reason people fake deaths. He leaned back in his chair, which squeaked under his weight. You said she mentioned his work policy, but he left that job months before he supposedly died? Right. So either she's lying about the insurance, or there's another policy somewhere. Jack closed his notebook. Give me a week. I'll see what I can dig up. What if he's really dead and I'm just a crazy old woman who can't accept it? Jack's tired eyes got a little kinder. Then we'll know for sure, and you can grieve properly. But Mrs. Hutchinson, in 30 years of doing this job, I've learned to trust a mother's instincts. If something feels wrong to you, it probably is. Jack called me 5 days later. You're going to want to sit down for this, he said. I was already sitting at my kitchen table, but I gripped the edge anyway. First, the insurance. Your son had a $500,000 life insurance policy through a private company called Secure Life Insurance. Brittany is listed as the beneficiary. She filed the claim 2 days after she says he died. $500,000. That was more money than I'd ever seen in my life. That was enough to buy a house, pay off debts, start a new life somewhere. That was serious money. But here's the interesting part, Jack continued. I talked to my contact at Secure Life. I used to work insurance fraud cases when I was with the state police. They're investigating because the death certificate has some serious problems with it. What kind of problems? The doctor who supposedly signed it? Dr. William Hayes retired 3 years ago and moved to Florida. And the medical examiner's signature doesn't match their records. Someone forged both signatures, and they did a pretty sloppy job of it. My hands started shaking. So, the death certificate is fake? Looking that way. But it gets better. I found your son. The world stopped. What? He's alive, Mrs. Hutchinson. I found him working at a coffee shop in Portland, Oregon, under the name Gary Mitchell. He's been there about 2 months. I couldn't breathe.
Couldn't think.
My son was alive. My boy was alive. But Jack, if he's alive, why did he let me think he was dead? Why hasn't he called me? That's what we need to find out. I'm flying to Portland tomorrow. Do you want to come with me? 24 hours later, I was on an airplane for the first time in 15 years, flying to Oregon with a private investigator to find my supposedly dead son. If someone had told me a month earlier that this would be my life, I'd have suggested they see a doctor. The flight was turbulent, and I spent most of it gripping the armrests and trying not to think about what I'd say to Garrett when I saw him. I was angry, confused, hurt, and relieved all at the same time. Part of me wanted to hug him and never let go. Part of me wanted to shake him until he explained what the hell he thought he was doing. Jack had found Garrett working at a place called Sunrise Coffee in a neighborhood called Hawthorne. He'd rented a tiny studio apartment nearby and was living under the name Gary Mitchell. According to Jack's research, Gary Mitchell was a real person who died in a car accident in Nevada 3 years ago, but somehow his identity had been stolen and recreated. How did Garrett get hold of a dead man's identity? I asked as our plane descended into Portland. That's the million-dollar question, Jack said. Creating a fake identity this clean takes serious connections. Someone who knows how to access Social Security databases, maybe someone in the morgue business or vital records office. This isn't something you can just Google. You think it was Brittany? I think Brittany's in on it, but she's not smart enough to pull this off alone. This took planning and connections. Someone helped them, and I'm betting they got paid well for it. We landed at 2:30 p.m. Pacific Time. Jack had rented a car, and we drove through Portland's busy streets while I tried to calm my nerves. The city was bigger than I'd expected, with tall buildings and busy traffic. The weather was gray and drizzly, typical for Oregon in November. I was about to see my son for the first time since he'd supposedly died. The son who'd let me grieve for him while he was serving coffee to strangers in Oregon. I didn't know whether I wanted to hug him or slap him. Sunrise Coffee was in a row of cute little shops with big windows and colorful signs. It looked like the kind of place that served $12 sandwiches to college students and artists. The neighborhood had that trendy, gentrified feel, with vintage stores and yoga studios mixed in with the coffee shops and restaurants. We parked across the street and watched through the window. And there he was, my Garrett, wearing a green apron and steaming milk behind the counter. He looked thinner than I remembered, and he'd grown a beard, but it was definitely my boy. He had the same way of tilting his head when he was concentrating, the same habit of pushing his hair back with his hand. "What do you want to do?" Jack asked softly. I watched my son make a latte for a woman with purple hair. He was smiling and chatting with her like he didn't have a care in the world. Like his mother wasn't back home crying over his fake grave. "I want to know why," I said. "Before I talk to him, I need to understand what happened." Jack nodded. "Let's wait until his shift ends. Follow him home. See if anyone's with him." So we sat in that rental car for 3 hours, watching my dead son serve coffee and pastries. It was the longest 3 hours of my life. I watched him laugh with customers, wipe down tables, and act like a completely normal person living a completely normal life. Every few minutes, I had to remind myself that this was real, that my son was actually alive. At one point, he came outside to empty the trash, and I got a clear look at his face. He looked tired, older than his 34 years. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his smile seemed forced when he talked to customers. Whatever had led him to this point, he didn't look happy about it. Garrett finished work at 6 p.m. and walked 6 blocks to a small apartment building. We followed him at a distance, then watched him go inside. Jack had already found out he lived in apartment 2A. We waited another hour, then Jack went to the door and knocked. I stayed hidden around the corner, my heart beating so fast I thought I might pass out. "Gary Mitchell?" I heard Jack say when the door opened. "Yeah." That was Garrett's voice. My son's voice. Hearing it after thinking he was dead almost brought me to my knees. "My name's Jack Morrison. I'm a private investigator, and I need to talk to you about Garrett Hutchinson." A long pause. Then, "I don't know what you're talking about." "Son, I've got photos of you from high school, fingerprints from your old apartment, and your mother sitting around the corner. You want to keep playing games, or you want to invite me in so we can talk like adults?" Another pause. Then I heard footsteps and a door closing. 5 minutes later, Jack came back and got me. "He wants to see you," Jack said. "But Mrs. Hutchinson, you should know he's scared. Really scared. And not of you." We went up to apartment 2A together. Jack knocked again, and this time the door opened right away. And there was my son.
My boy.
Alive and breathing and standing right in front of me. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to cry. I wanted to ask him a million questions. Instead, I just stood there staring at him like he was a ghost. "Can we come in?" Jack asked. Garrett stepped aside, and we walked into the tiniest apartment I'd ever seen. It was basically one room with a kitchenette and a bathroom. There was a mattress on the floor, a few clothes hanging in an open closet, and a small TV on a plastic table. The place smelled like instant coffee and loneliness. "This is how you've been living?" I asked, finding my voice. "It's not so bad. Better than being dead." "Why?" The word came out like a sob. "Why did you do this to me? Do you know what the last month has been like?" Garrett sat down on the edge of his mattress and put his head in his hands. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I never wanted you to get hurt. That wasn't supposed to happen." "Then what was supposed to happen?" He looked up at me with tears in his eyes. "I was supposed to disappear for a while. Brittany would collect the insurance money, and then I'd come back and we'd split it. We figured the insurance company would think I'd drowned or something, and eventually they'd pay out. I was going to call you then and tell you I'd been in an accident and lost my memory or something." I sank into the only chair in the room, a plastic thing from Walmart. "So you and Brittany planned this together?" "It was her idea. Mom, I was in so much trouble. I'd lost my job, lost my apartment, and I owed some really bad people a lot of money." "What kind of people?" Jack leaned forward. "Gambling debts." Garrett nodded miserably. "I got into online poker about a year ago. At first I was winning, but then I wasn't. I kept thinking I could win it back, but I just kept losing more. By the time I got evicted, I owed almost $60,000 to some guys who don't exactly send polite reminders." The pieces started falling into place. The financial problems, the lost apartment, the stress I'd heard in his voice during our last few conversations. "So, you faked your death instead of coming to your mother for help." I couldn't keep the hurt out of my voice. "Mom, you don't have $60,000. Nobody in our family has that kind of money. But the life insurance policy, Brittany found out about it when we got married. She said it was our way out." "Whose idea was it to not tell me?" "That was Brittany too," Garrett said quietly. She said if you knew I was alive, you might accidentally let something slip. She said it was safer if you really believed I was dead. Safer for who? I stood up, anger finally overtaking the hurt. Do you have any idea what you put me through? I sat by your fake grave and apologized for not being at your funeral. I blamed myself for not knowing you were sick. I thought I'd failed as a mother. Mom, Garrett started crying then, really crying. I know it was horrible. I wanted to call you so many times. But those guys I owe money to, they know where you live. If they figured out I was still alive, they'd come after you to get to me. Jack spoke up. Son, faking your death to defraud an insurance company is a felony. Multiple felonies, actually. You could go to prison for 20 years. I know, Garrett whispered. But what choice did I have? I couldn't pay the money back, and those guys, they weren't going to wait much longer. How did you get Gary Mitchell's identity? Jack asked. Garrett looked uncomfortable. Brittany found someone. Some guy she knew from her old job at the county clerk's office. He had access to death records and social security databases. Cost us $5,000, but he created the whole identity. Birth certificate, social security card, everything. What was this guy's name? Marcus Webb. He worked in vital records. Brittany said he'd done this kind of thing before for people who needed to disappear. Jack was taking notes. We'll need to report him too. This is organized identity theft. I looked at my son, my scared, foolish, desperate son sitting on a mattress in a tiny apartment, and I made a decision that probably wasn't smart, but felt right in my heart. Jack, I said, how much trouble is Garrett in if we go to the police right now? A lot. The insurance fraud, the fake ID, the forged death certificate, he's looking at serious prison time. And if we don't go to the police? Jack raised an eyebrow. What are you thinking, Mrs. Hutchinson? I'm thinking my son made some bad choices, but he's not a criminal. He's just a scared kid who got in over his head. I looked at Garrett. How much has Brittany collected from the insurance company? Nothing yet. They haven't paid out because of the investigation. And these people you owe money to, they think you're dead?
Yeah.
Brittany put an obituary in the paper and everything. An idea was forming in my mind. A crazy, probably illegal idea that would either save my son or get us all arrested. Jack, I said slowly, how good are you at revenge? We spent the next 2 hours in Garrett's tiny apartment, planning something that would either be brilliant or land us all in federal prison. Jack turned out to have a creative side when it came to turning the tables on people who deserved it. The more we talked, the more I realized that Brittany had manipulated my son when he was at his most vulnerable, convinced him that ruining his mother's life was an acceptable price for her financial gain. Here's what we know, Jack said, spreading papers across Garrett's plastic table. Brittany filed a fraudulent insurance claim for $500,000. She forged a death certificate and created a fake grave. She's probably committed at least 6 different felonies. But so has Garrett, I pointed out.
True.
But Garrett was coerced by threats of violence, and he hasn't actually received any money yet. Brittany's the one who initiated the fraud and stands to profit from it. Garrett was quiet, just listening. He looked exhausted, like he'd been carrying a huge weight for months. I noticed he kept checking his phone, as if he was expecting a call or a message from someone. What if we let her collect the money? I asked. Both men stared at me. Hear me out. What if we let the insurance company pay out the claim? Then we have proof she committed fraud. Real, actionable proof. Mom, that's $500,000. Money that she'll have to pay back with interest and penalties when she gets arrested. I turned to Jack. That would work, wouldn't it? It could, but it's risky. What if she takes the money and runs? Then we make sure she doesn't get the chance. Jack grinned for the first time since I'd met him. Mrs. Hutchinson, I like the way you think. Here's what we planned. First, Garrett would stay dead for a few more weeks while we gathered evidence of Brittany's fraud. Jack would document everything: the fake death certificate, the bogus grave, the forged signatures. Second, we'd let the insurance company pay out the claim. This would give us concrete proof that Brittany had collected money under false pretenses. Third, once Brittany had the money, I would confront her with evidence of what she'd done and give her a choice: return the money and face the consequences, or have us go to the police with everything we'd found. But what about the people Garrett owes money to? I asked. Jack had an answer for that too. I still have contacts in law enforcement. We call in a tip to the FBI about illegal gambling operations, loan sharking, threatening violence to collect debts. These guys have bigger problems than one missing gambler. Once the feds start investigating them, they'll be too busy to worry about Garrett. And Marcus Webb? I asked. Him too. Identity theft, falsifying government documents, conspiracy to commit fraud. The FBI will love this case. It hits all their favorite crimes. It wasn't perfect. There were a million things that could go wrong. But it was better than letting Brittany get away with putting me through hell while stealing $500,000. Are you sure about this, Mom? Garrett asked. If this backfires, I could go to prison. I looked at my son, really looked at him. He was thin and scared, and living like a refugee in his own country. But he was alive, and that's all that mattered. Honey, you should have come to me when you were in trouble. We're family. Family takes care of each other, even when they mess up. I took his hand. But that woman, she let me think my only child was dead, so she could steal money. She watched me grieve and didn't care. That's not something I can forgive. So we're really doing this? Jack nodded. We're doing this. But first, your mom needs to go home and act like a grieving mother for a few more weeks. Can you handle that, Mrs. Hutchinson? I've been acting like a grieving mother for a month. I can do it a little longer if it means making Brittany pay for what she did. Flying back to my regular life after finding out my son was alive was one of the strangest experiences of my life. I had to act sad and heartbroken when really I felt like singing from the rooftops. But underneath the relief, there was anger building. The more I thought about what Brittany had done, the more furious I became. She hadn't just committed insurance fraud.
She had tortured me.
She had watched me fall apart with grief and done nothing. She had let me blame myself for not being there when my son died. She had stolen my peace of mind, my ability to trust my own instincts, my faith in family bonds. The money was just the tip of the iceberg. Jack flew back with me but stayed in a hotel near the airport. We needed him close by, but couldn't risk Brittany seeing him around town. Meanwhile, Garrett would stay in Portland and keep his head down for a few more weeks. The hardest part was going back to Green Valley Cemetery and pretending to grieve at that fake grave. But I did it twice a week, bringing flowers and talking to the empty dirt like a proper grieving mother should. Each time, I had to fight the urge to smile, knowing that somewhere in Portland, my son was alive and making coffee for hipsters. I also had to field sympathy calls from neighbors and friends who'd heard about Garrett's death. Mrs. Henderson brought me casseroles. My book club sent a flower arrangement. The mailman asked how I was holding up. Each expression of sympathy made me feel like a fraud, but it also reminded me of how many people Brittany's lie had affected. She hadn't just hurt me, she'd hurt everyone who cared about our family. During those weeks of waiting, I learned more about Brittany than I'd ever known before. Jack did some digging and discovered that she'd been in financial trouble long before she met Garrett. She had massive student loan debt, 3 maxed-out credit cards, and had been living paycheck to paycheck for years. Her marriage to Garrett hadn't been about love, it had been about finding someone stable who could help her get out of debt. When Garrett lost his job and started gambling, Brittany saw an opportunity. She could get rid of her financial problems and her increasingly troublesome husband at the same time. The life insurance policy was just too tempting to pass up. 3 weeks after our trip to Portland, Jack called with news. The insurance company approved the claim. Brittany's getting a check for $500,000 minus taxes. It should arrive in about a week. How do you know all this? My contact at Secure Life. Remember, I used to investigate insurance fraud for the state. I still have friends in the business, and they're keeping me updated on the case. But I thought they were investigating the problems with the death certificate. They were. But Brittany provided additional documentation that satisfied their concerns. Fake medical records, forged hospital admission forms, even a bogus autopsy report. She's been busy. A week later, Jack called again. She got the money, deposited the whole check yesterday into an account at First National Bank. My friend at the bank confirmed it $425,000 after taxes. Now came the fun part. I called Brittany on a Tuesday morning, exactly 6 weeks after she'd told me my son was dead. Hi, Brittany. I was wondering if we could meet for coffee. There are some things about Garrett I'd like to talk about. Her voice was different, lighter, like someone who'd just won the lottery. Of course, Marlene. I'd love to. How about that little place on Main Street? Say 2 o'clock. Perfect. See you then. I hung up and called Jack. It's time. Café Luna was busy at 2 in the afternoon, full of people having late lunch and catching up with friends. I got there early and chose a table in the back corner where we could talk privately. Jack was at a table near the front door, reading a newspaper with a recording device hidden inside it. I watched Brittany through the window as she parked her car. It was a brand new BMW, bright red with temporary tags. She'd been busy spending her blood money. Brittany walked in 5 minutes late, wearing a new dress that probably cost more than my car payment. Her hair was freshly done, and she was carrying a designer purse I'd seen in magazines. Everything about her screamed expensive, from her shoes to her jewelry to her perfectly manicured nails. Marlene, she said, giving me a fake hug that smelled like expensive perfume. You look good. How are you holding up? I'm getting by. One day at a time, you know? She ordered a $15 coffee drink with extra shots and whipped cream. I stuck with regular coffee. So, what did you want to talk about? She asked, settling into her chair. I've been thinking about Garrett's funeral, about how I wasn't there. Brittany's smile faltered just a little. Oh, Marlene, we've been through this. It happened so fast, and Garrett specifically said he didn't want a big fuss. I know, but I was thinking maybe we could have a memorial service? Something just for me to say goodbye properly. That's sweet, but I think it's better to just let him rest in peace, don't you? I took a sip of my coffee and studied her face. She looked nervous now, fidgeting with her new purse. The thing is, Brittany, I visited his grave last week, and something seemed off about it. Off how? Well, I was talking to the groundskeeper, and he mentioned that the grave was smaller than usual. Like maybe it wasn't a full burial? Brittany's face went white. I don't know what you mean. So I did a little digging. Not literally, of course. I smiled sweetly. I called the hospital where Garrett supposedly died. They have no record of him ever being treated there. Maybe you called the wrong hospital. I called 6 hospitals. None of them had any record of Garrett Hutchinson being treated for cancer. Brittany stood up suddenly. I don't have to listen to this. You're obviously having some kind of breakdown. Sit down, Brittany. Something in my voice made her freeze. Sit down, and let me tell you what else I found out. She sat. I opened my purse and pulled out a folder Jack had prepared for me. I found out that Garrett lost his job 6 months before he supposedly died. I found out he was evicted from his apartment in August. And I found out that the doctor who signed his death certificate retired 3 years ago. Brittany's hands were shaking now. But the most interesting thing I found out, I continued, is that my son is alive and living in Portland, Oregon, under the name Gary Mitchell. Brittany made a choking sound. That's right. I found him. I talked to him. And he told me all about your little plan to fake his death and split the insurance money. You're lying, she whispered. I pulled out my phone and showed her a picture Jack had taken of Garrett at the coffee shop. $500,000, Brittany. That's a lot of money to steal from an insurance company. It's not stealing. He's my husband. Ex-husband, actually. I also found out that Garrett filed for divorce 4 months ago. You were served papers at your apartment on July 18th, but you ignored them. The divorce was finalized without you. This was another detail Jack had uncovered. Brittany had been avoiding the divorce papers by having mail forwarded to a post office box, but she'd been legally served by a process server who tracked her down at work. Brittany slumped in her chair like someone had let all the air out of her. Here's what's going to happen, I said calmly. You're going to return every penny of that insurance money. You're going to sign a confession admitting what you did, and you're going to pray that I don't decide to press charges anyway. I can't. I already spent some of it. How much? 20,000. Maybe 25. I looked over at Jack, who gave me a small nod. He'd been recording everything through the device in his fake newspaper. Then you'll return what's left and work out a payment plan for the rest. The alternative is 20 years in federal prison for insurance fraud. You can't prove anything. I smiled. Brittany, honey, I can prove everything. The fake death certificate with a dead doctor's signature. The bogus grave with construction scraps instead of a coffin. The forged medical records. The fact that my very much alive son is working at Sunrise Coffee in Portland and will testify that this was all your idea. She started crying then. Not pretty tears, but ugly, desperate sobs. I needed the money, she wailed. You don't understand. I have debts too. Credit cards, student loans. I thought if I could just get enough money to start over. So, you decided to torture a grieving mother to get it? I didn't think about that part. I thought it would be easy. I stood up and put a $20 bill on the table to cover our coffee. You have 24 hours to return the money to the insurance company and turn yourself in. If you don't, Jack Morrison here will turn everything over to the FBI. Brittany looked up in confusion. Who's Jack Morrison? I nodded toward the front of the cafe, where Jack was folding up his newspaper. The private investigator I hired to find my son. The one who's been recording this entire conversation. Jack walked over and handed Brittany a business card. Nice to meet you, Miss Parker. He'd used her maiden name, which she'd gone back to after the divorce was finalized. We'll be in touch. We left Brittany sitting there crying into her expensive coffee, and I felt better than I had in months. Brittany didn't turn herself in. Instead, she tried to run. Jack called me at 6:30 the next morning. She cleaned out her bank account and bought a one-way ticket to Mexico. Flight leaves at noon. Can we stop her? Already done. I called my FBI contact last night after our little coffee date. They've been watching her since yesterday afternoon. At 11:45 a.m., just as Brittany was going through security at the airport, federal agents arrested her for insurance fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy. The news made the local paper that evening. Local woman arrested in $500,000 insurance scam. The article mentioned that her deceased husband was actually alive and living in another state, but it didn't name Garrett. Jack had worked out a deal where my son would testify against Brittany in exchange for immunity from prosecution. 3 days later, Garrett came home. I picked him up at the airport, and when I saw him walking off that plane, I started crying all over again. But this time they were happy tears. I'm sorry, Mom, he said, hugging me tight right there in the terminal. I'm so sorry for everything. You're home now. That's all that matters. We drove to my house, where I'd made his favorite dinner, meatloaf with mashed potatoes and green beans. Simple food for a complicated homecoming. As we sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd received that horrible phone call 6 weeks earlier, everything felt different. The house that had been so quiet and empty was full of life again. "What happens now?" he asked as we sat at my kitchen table. "Now you testify against Brittany. Then you get your life back." "What about the gambling debts?" Jack's FBI friends raided the illegal gambling operation last week. Turns out they were involved in a lot more than just taking bets. "The guys you owed money to are looking at federal charges for racketeering. They're not going to be bothering anybody for a long time." Garrett pushed food around on his plate. "I still can't believe Brittany was willing to let you think I was dead just for money. Some people show you who they really are when they think nobody's watching. Brittany showed me she's the kind of person who would torture a grieving mother for $500,000. Over the next few weeks, more details emerged about the conspiracy. Marcus Webb, the county clerk who'd helped create Garrett's fake identity, was arrested along with 2 other employees. They'd been running an identity theft ring for years, selling fake documents to people who needed to disappear. The FBI found records of over 30 fake identities they'd created, all using the identities of recently deceased people. 3 cemetery employees were also arrested for their role in creating the fake grave. They'd been paid $2,000 each to dig a shallow hole and bury construction scraps instead of a body. The cemetery fired all of them and implemented new security measures to prevent future fraud. Brittany's trial was all over the local news. The prosecutor called it one of the most callous insurance fraud cases he'd ever seen, especially because of how she'd treated me. The jury agreed. She got 12 years in federal prison and had to pay back the full $500,000 plus penalties and interest. During the trial, more shocking details came out. Brittany had done this before. 2 years earlier, she'd been married to a man named Kevin Walsh in Nevada. When that marriage fell apart, she'd convinced Kevin to fake his death so she could collect on his life insurance policy. Kevin had disappeared to California while Brittany collected $200,000 from his insurance company. The difference was that Kevin didn't have a mother who refused to give up. Kevin's father had died years earlier, and his mother had dementia and was in a nursing home. When Brittany told her that Kevin was dead, the poor woman believed it and grieved alone. She died 6 months later, never knowing her son was actually alive. That revelation made me sick to my stomach. This woman had stolen not just money, but final moments between a mother and son. She'd let an elderly woman with dementia die thinking her child was gone. The judge was even less sympathetic after hearing about Kevin's case. Instead of the 8 to 10 years the prosecution had recommended, she gave Brittany the full 12 years. Kevin testified at the trial via video link from California, where he'd been living under a fake name for 2 years. Unlike Garrett, he'd never planned to come back. He'd used the fake death to escape gambling debts and start over completely. He had no family left to hurt, so he saw no reason to return. But Kevin's testimony helped convict Brittany and Marcus Webb. He explained how Brittany had found Webb through criminal connections and how the whole operation worked. His evidence led to the discovery of dozens of other fake identities and insurance fraud cases. Most importantly, Kevin revealed that he was the one who'd made the anonymous tip to Secure Life Insurance about Garrett's case. He'd been following news about our case online, and when he saw Garrett's name in an article about Brittany's arrest, he recognized the pattern. He'd called the insurance company and told them to investigate the Hutchinson claim because he suspected it was another one of Brittany's scams. If he hadn't made that call, Jack explained to me later, the insurance company might have paid out before we had time to investigate. Kevin's tip is what started the fraud investigation that gave us time to find the truth. It felt good to know that Kevin, despite his own mistakes, had tried to prevent another family from going through what he'd put his mother through. Sometimes people surprise you. Garrett testified against Brittany too, explaining how she'd convinced him that faking his death was their only option. The judge was sympathetic to him, especially after hearing about the gambling debts and the threats he'd received. In the end, Garrett got 2 years of probation and 500 hours of community service. He moved back into my house while he got back on his feet. It took him a few months to find a job. Explaining a 6-month gap in employment is tricky when you can't say you were dead, but eventually he landed a position with a small tech company that didn't ask too many questions. The best part was watching him rebuild his confidence. The scared, desperate man I'd found in Portland was slowly becoming my son again. He started going to Gamblers Anonymous meetings and seeing a therapist to deal with his addiction. He even started dating a nice woman named Rachel who worked at the library and didn't care about his past mistakes. As for me, I learned that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. For years, I'd thought of myself as just Garrett's mom, someone who needed taking care of. But when push came to shove, I'd tracked down my son across the country, outsmarted a criminal, and made sure justice was served. Jack and I stayed friends. He said I had a natural talent for investigation and offered to teach me the business. I wasn't ready to become a private eye at 58, but it was nice to know I had options. The insurance company where I exposed the fraud offered me a part-time job as a fraud investigator. They said my case had helped them identify weaknesses in their system and prevent future scams. It turned out that a lifetime of raising kids and managing a household gave me excellent skills for spotting when people were lying. The work was fascinating. I helped investigate suspicious claims, interviewed claimants, and worked with law enforcement when necessary. My first big case involved a man who claimed his house had burned down accidentally, but something about his story didn't add up. I noticed inconsistencies in his timeline and found evidence that he deliberately set the fire. The insurance company saved $300,000 by denying that claim. I'm writing this story exactly 2 years after Brittany's phone call changed my life. Garrett is doing well. He's engaged to Rachel now, and they're planning a small wedding next spring. He's been gambling free for 18 months and says he doesn't even miss it anymore. We talk about what happens sometimes, usually late at night when we're both having trouble sleeping. He still feels guilty about putting me through that pain, and I still feel guilty about not seeing the signs that he was in trouble. But mostly, we're just grateful to have each other back. The fake grave at Green Valley Cemetery has been removed. In its place, the cemetery planted a small garden with a bench where families can sit and remember their loved ones. There's a little plaque that says, "In memory of those who are truly missed." I never did get to say goodbye to my son at a funeral, but I got something better. I got to say hello to him at an airport when he came home. Brittany will be in prison for 10 more years. I don't hate her anymore. Hate takes too much energy, and I'd rather spend mine on better things. But I don't forgive her either. Some things are just too cruel to forgive, especially after learning about what she did to Kevin's mother. Jack Morrison is still solving cases and still calls me every few months to check in. He says I'm the most resourceful client he's ever had, which is probably the best compliment I've ever received. The insurance company created a new fraud detection system based on what happened in our case. They sent me a letter thanking me for my diligence in exposing criminal activity, which was a fancy way of saying thanks for catching the bad guys. These days, I work part-time as a fraud investigator and volunteer at a support group for families of missing persons. It turns out that having your child disappear, even temporarily, gives you a special understanding of what other parents go through. I can't bring their children home, but I can listen to their stories and help them navigate the system. Garrett comes with me sometimes. He talks to young people about gambling addiction and how easy it is to get in over your head. He's not proud of what he did, but he's learned that sharing his story can help other people avoid making the same mistakes. We're a family again. Different than before, maybe a little more careful with each other, but stronger in some ways. We know now that we can get through anything as long as we stick together. And we know that when someone tries to hurt our family, we don't just roll over and take it. We fight back and we win. If you're dealing with something similar, if someone is trying to take advantage of you or your family, don't give up. Get help. Ask questions. Trust your instincts. And remember that sometimes the people who seem the most helpless can surprise everyone, including themselves. My name is Marlene Hutchinson. I'm 60 years old now, and I brought my son back from the dead by refusing to believe the lies people told me. Sometimes the best revenge is just refusing to be a victim. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey of a mother's love and ruthless justice. If this story moved you, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell to join our community of people who believe that evil should never win. Remember, the strongest force in the world isn't money or power. It's a mother protecting her child. Until next time, this is Her True Stories, where justice always finds a way.